Morning. Today is Tuesday, February 5th, 2019. It's a regular meeting of the Los Angeles Board of Police Commissioners. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Good morning. Let the record reflect Commissioner Sobroff, Decker, Bonner, Figueroa, Villa, and Goldsmith are present, and we have a quorum.
Okay. The first item up are five consent agenda items. Are there any commissioner questions, comments on the consent agenda items? Do you have any public comments on the consent agenda?
We have done, sir.
We have a motion for approval of items number 1A, B, C, D, and E. So moved. We have a second. Thank you, Commissioner Figueroa, for second. Oh, you did second? I didn't hear you. All in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? 5-0. Item number 2, regular agenda items. The first item is the juvenile arrest procedures audit, 2A. Okay. Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Commissioners, Chief, Inspector General. Jeffrey Phillips, Commanding Officer of Audit Division. To my right is Wendy Gamble. She's one of my officers in charge. And, of course, Commander Rodriguez. Before you, you have the juvenile procedures audit, which looked at various aspects of the department policy and procedures related to juvenile arrests. This audit entailed a total of 21 objectives and sub-objectives, for which most of the results indicated the department performed well. However, there were 2 audit objectives that indicated continued need for improvement, and that was Objective 4A, the timeliness of parental notifications, and Objective 4C, the documentation of the phone calls made by juvenile arrestees.
How about 5C?
Say again?
How about 5C? That came in at 80.
Oh.
Detention.
You see that?
Detention.
Evaluation of security. Okay.
We did make a recommendation related to the specificity in the department manual and defining immediate steps in notifying juveniles' parents to be within 1 hour, so this language corresponds with the juvenile arrest supplemental report. That concludes my presentation.
Okay. Do we have any commissioner questions or comments on the audit?
Go ahead.
Okay. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I wonder if you can elaborate a little more on the 1 hour notification rule and procedures and what changed and the action the department is taking as a result.
Good morning, Commander Rodriguez for the Office of Operations. So, Commissioner, one of the issues that we discovered in this audit was the fact that the guideline that is currently in place differs from our department policy, where the guideline talks about 1 hour, yet our policy talks about immediately, which could lead to some misinterpretation by the officers what that immediacy means. What we did find is that that was a case in 9 commands, 14 cases, 9 commands, where mostly there were 1 cases. We only had 1 command which had 3 instances which was not conducted within the time frame. What we've done, obviously, is we've had communications with these commands and letting them know to ensure that whenever a juvenile is taken into custody, that those hours are provided within the first hour, and further emphasized what the guidelines are. And obviously also we're in the process of getting our department policy changed to make sure that we match with what the guidelines are.
So that's actually my question. You are making that change. I saw it was one of the recommendations, but when I read the response, it wasn't clear to me that you would actually be updating the...
Correct. That is currently being in the works, is being researched, and it will be updated.
So that it will be clear in
Correct.
the future. Okay, very good. That was my question.
Okay.
Appreciate the audit and glad to see a high level of compliance in most areas, and appreciate the effort to make sure we make improvements where the compliance was lower. And just, want to acknowledge the department's work around arrest diversion and keeping kids from being arrested in the first place, particularly under the leadership of Chief Arcos and Captain Espinosa and you, to refer kids to diversion programs so they don't get arrested and taken into custody. So if you want to just share a brief word about that, I know you're not prepared to go into those details, but would love to ask this to come back to a future meeting where we could do a deep dive on the work that the department is doing on pre-arrest diversion for youth, which is definitely the LAPD's playing a leadership role in the county and across the state on these issues, and would like to make sure that the full commission gets the opportunity to learn about those programs.
Absolutely. So for the Office of Operations, that is one of our staple projects for this year, is to fully implement the diversion program in all 21 geographic areas. Our goal is to ensure that when these juveniles are coming into contact with law enforcement, they're provided that second opportunity. We're currently working with two vendors that are currently providing all the diversion programs. We're hoping to expand that so that we can have the capacity and have every single juvenile just about that we come into contact be provided with this type of diversion programs. Obviously, we are currently working with our juvenile division to standardize what those protocols are going to look like. In our CompStat inspection processes, that is one of the primary focuses in question that I take and ask the commands to ensure that not only the detectives are complying with the protocols, but also that data is being ingrained down at the officer level so that the officers understand the importance of the diversion program and that they are, in fact, diverting these juveniles out to the appropriate source.
Great.
Good morning, Commissioners. Bob Arcos from the Office of Operations. Thanks for the acknowledgement, especially the work that's being done by Captain Espinoza and Detective Bureau on pulling all these things together. I've been informed that we are on calendar next week for a full presentation in front of the Commission.
Thank you.
And I actually am excited about a phone call I'm going to take later today with Ann Tremblay to discuss a little bit more about GRID's active role in juvenile diversion. So thanks for all the support.
Thank you. It's really extraordinary work. I mean, to say that you want to divert these kids, most of the kids you come into contact with, you don't want to be arresting them and you want to put them into community-based programs is a very powerful statement for a law enforcement agency to make, and your leadership there is tremendous.
Thank you.
Do we have any public comments on the item 2A?
We have one. We have Jamie Garcia.
Good morning.
So I found it really important to come up and comment about this audit today, especially with the gang enforcement detail taking so much media right now, which we will address as well. But seeing how this juvenile audit just kind of slipped in regards to probable cause, reasonable suspicion, and of course, LAPD passes with flying colors every time they engage with our youth. And it's interesting that next week we're going to talk about this diversion program. But what we're not talking about is how old Jesse Romero was killed when he was killed in a laser zone, and he was 14 years old. He was a little boy. How Daniel Perez was 16-year-old. He was a young man as well, young child, I would say. And it's really sad to see us, talk about the great work of LAPD, explain how, kind of proclaim how amazing they are, but at the same time knowing, and I'm sure you know, that this child was murdered by LAPD. And it's not just enough to say that we want diversion and we're so glad that you're working with vendors to prevent this from happening again, but it's happened and it's already happened. And so there's no bringing back Jesse Romero. There's no, comforting his mother every time his birthday comes around, every time Christmas comes around. There's nothing that you can do to bring him back. So there's no audit that will make us say, okay, great, I'm glad LAPD is finally stopping murdering children. There's nothing you can do. And even diversion programs don't make the community feel better or feel safer, knowing that our union, our teachers have to go on strike just to get schools for kids. So, I really just wanted to come up and just say shame on you. Shame on you for not doing more. Shame on you for not uplifting Jesse Romero's name every single time you speak about juveniles, because that's what you should be doing. That's what you should be remembering, is the fact that they killed the child.
Thanks. Do we have a motion for approval of item number 2A, please? Motion for approval? Yes. Do we have a second? Yes. All in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? 5-0. Item number 2B, the Inspector General's report. regarding the review of the gang enforcement detail stops. And Commissioner Goldsmith, will you you've been intimately involved in this. I'd like you to sort of lead the discussion.
Oh, thank you. Sure, I do have some things to say and some questions to ask, but do you want to start with a very brief, I mean, we all read the report, obviously, multiple times, I'm sure, so maybe just a brief overview of the highlights as you see them.
If I could actually start, Commissioners, good morning. Commissioners, good morning, Chief, good morning, everyone. If I can begin quickly by introducing Assistant Inspector General Camelia Naguib and Police Special Investigator Jen Gomez from the Office of Inspector General. Our office was requested by the Police Commission to look into proactive policing and discretionary stops conducted by this department. Those are as opposed to stops in response to radio calls, service calls, but stops where officers are making a decision to detain someone or to initiate a consensual encounter of someone. The first way we attempted to do so was to look specifically at the department's gang enforcement detail units that operate throughout the city. To give a sense, it's somewhere on the order of roughly 300 or so, possibly a little more officers throughout the city. And they conduct such stops as a measure of crime suppression and looking for ways to combat violent crime. There will be a second part to our look into this general area, which will focus on the department's Metro division. That will come in the second half of this year. Our goal in looking at the gang enforcement detail, or GED units, was to really look deeply at each individual stop in a selection that we picked out of the stops from 2 months last summer, July and August. We selected 91 such cases, and in each case we wanted to look deeply at them to determine what was lawful in the stop, what was justified, the stop itself, any post-stop activities such as searches of a person or a car, and how did officers articulate their justification for taking such action. Where we found issues, we wanted to understand what were those issues and how can they be addressed. The report we did in spending the time looking deeply at these cases also gave us the opportunity to look at a couple other issues as well. We looked at the activations of both body-worn video cameras by officers to make sure they were conducted in accordance with policy, as well as digital in-car video activation. And we also looked, as we are doing with more frequency and regularity now, at the concept of procedural justice taking place in each of these stops. We want to make sure that people feel that they are the stops are legitimate, that they have a chance to be heard, and if there are any areas where the department falls short, we want to find how we can help fix that. The department, for its part, was quite responsive. We found a couple of issues early on as we selected some of these cases, and we were concerned. We told them about it. As we continued our work, they immediately began remedial measures. We'll go into these. They're in more detail in our report, and I think we'll mention them in our presentation in just a second. But they included training and documentation of requirements that officers need to be mindful of and follow. In doing our report and selecting the cases, what we did was focus on the groups that are most frequently stopped by GED, and that ended up being Latino males, African-American males, and white males. And to tell you a little more about how we selected our sample and how we did our report, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Gomez.
Good morning. Hi.
Morning.
So what we did was we aggregated the stops by incident number, so that if there was more than one person in a stop, we just counted it as one incident or one stop. Our population, as Mark stated, began with gang enforcement detail stops from July 1st of 2018 through August 31st of 2018. When we chose to look at stops, again, as the Inspector General indicated, that included at least one Black, Hispanic, and white male in order to allow for comparison amongst these groups. We sorted the population into separate groups by the aforementioned race and gender, and then we selected a random sample from each of these groups of males. We then used a one-tailed test for each group using a 95% confidence level with a plus precision of 7%. So our final sample included 31 stops of Black males, 31 stops of Hispanic males, and 29 stops of white males for a total of 91 stops. This was also a review where each incident that we looked at contained body-worn video, where in the past we've not had that luxury or pleasure of knowing exactly what occurred in each stop. And then also, as you may know, the department started collecting additional stop data in July of 2018 to comply with state law. So this is documented on the officer's automated field data report. And so our review of the stops consisted of looking at what the officers documented on their automated field data report, their logs, and any associated video or reports to determine that what was documented on the logs coincided with what was captured in the video. The video evidence. And so then I'm going to turn it over to Camelia now to go over the findings and summarize what we found.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to start with a brief overview of some of our major findings and then move on to some of our recommended next steps. As was previously mentioned, we looked at each of the 91 stops in a couple of different ways. The first thing we looked at was the stop itself. We looked to see whether, based on the information that the officers provided and the associated video, the initial stop appeared reasonable. In most of the cases, about 85%, we found that the stop did appear justified and that the officers had reasonable suspicion or probable cause to make the stop. These included, for example, traffic stops where officers observed a moving or equipment violation. In a small number of other cases, we could not assess the stop based on the available information. And we also found a few cases, about 7%, where we had concerns about the basis for the stop. These concerns fell into two categories. The first category were cases where officers documented that the encounter was consensual. But when we watched the video, we had concerns about whether that was actually the case based on what we were seeing in terms of gestures, statements, body language, etc. The second category included a small number of cases where, again, based on the information the officers provided and the video, we did not believe that the officers had articulated reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. The next area we looked at was whether there were any searches conducted during the stop, which could range from a pat-down or frisk to a search of the person or their property. For each search that we did find, we attempted to determine whether the officers articulated a legal basis for that search and whether that was supported by the video. Overall, we found that in 41% of cases, there was no search conducted. In another 23%, we found that the officers conducted at least one search and that those searches appeared reasonable. This might be, for example, because the person was on parole or because they gave consent to be searched. We also noted a few cases where we could not make a determination based on the information, and in the remaining cases, which were about 32% of the 91 cases, we did identify an issue with at least one of the searches during the stop. These issues fell into a few different categories. In some cases, the officers did not provide a reason for the search and we could not determine what that reason was, or they provided a reason that was insufficient or too general. In another set of cases, officers said that they searched the person because they were on probation, but when we watched the video, we did not see them checking to see whether the person had search conditions as part of their probation, which is required for a probation search to be considered reasonable. And finally, we found a series of cases where officers said that they had received consent to conduct a search. But when we watched the video, we did not see the person giving consent, or we found that they gave consent after at least one search had been conducted. The next area we looked at was that of procedural justice, and if you recall, the concept of procedural justice has to do with how a person is treated during a stop and how that affects community trust. This is an area that is an emerging best practice in policing and one that the Commission has adopted as a guiding value for the department. There are generally considered to be four components to procedural justice, which are 1, treating people with respect and dignity, 2, giving them a voice during the incident, 3, being neutral, fair, and transparent in decision-making, and 4, conveying trustworthy motives so that the person can understand why the action is being taken. Overall, and notwithstanding the issues we've already identified, we found that officers were generally respectful in interacting with the people during their stops. But we did find 2 areas where there was room for improvement with respect to procedural justice. The first area has to do with explaining the reason for the stop, which LAPD officers are required to do. There are about a quarter of cases where we could not hear the officers clearly articulate the reason for the stop to the person being stopped. We also noted cases where officers conducted a search without explaining the reason for that search. And we noted in the report that not including these explanations might lead people to think that these actions are taken for no reason. The second area has to do with the provision of business cards, which is something that we've brought up in previous reports. LAPD officers are required to provide a business card to any person that they do not arrest or cite, but we generally did not see that occurring in the cases that we reviewed. And these are 2 things that we believe will help to improve procedural justice during these stops. One other area that I want to touch briefly on is that of camera activation. In each case, we looked to see whether in-car video and body-worn videos were activated. And in general, we found that officers did turn on their body-worn cameras, although there were some cases where that was done late, and that affected our review. When it came to in-car videos, we found that about a quarter of cases, the in-car video was not turned on and there did not appear to be a justification. So this is something we recommend the department look at more closely. As the Inspector General noted, we had the opportunity to meet with the department early on in this process in November and to show them some of the issues that we found. Following that meeting, the department took a number of steps to address these issues, and I'll let them discuss that in more detail, but some of the steps included, for example, a series of bulletins and documents clarifying the areas that we noted, and then in January, the department brought all of its GED and Metro line officers out of the field for a 5-hour training that covered the issues that we had identified. We think that these steps are an important first step in addressing the concerns that we found. We also have a few additional recommendations for the Commission's consideration, which we believe will help to ensure that these areas continue to be reviewed and addressed on an ongoing basis. These recommendations include additional and ongoing training and clarification on the issues we've identified, the creation of systems that use stop data to identify and evaluate possible areas of concern or disparate treatment, the development of mechanisms to audit and review stops to ensure accountability, and the articulation of a set of clear expectations relating to procedural justice during stops. So that's just a brief overview of the report and our recommendations, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Goldsmith?
Chief, do you want to respond?
Good morning, Commissioners. And I have Chief Arcos as well as Chief Grimala here, and they're prepared to go into more details. I will just say, overall, first of all, I'm grateful for and thankful for this first inspection. I think the matter of the development of body-worn videos as a department-wide application, now that we last year collected 4 million instances of body-worn video, that this inspection allowed for a systematic review of a snapshot of 2 specific areas. One, the GED operations, and then later will follow is the metropolitan operations. Both units are important as a part of our balanced strategy in providing for public safety. Our GED officers are specially selected. They've received training and they're experienced officers, and their work in going out and developing intelligence and understanding of how gangs are operating, the crimes and violence that they're involved in, efforts and strategies to interrupt those actions, as well as to prevent and intervene and direct children and young people and others away from the gang lifestyle is important work. This analysis of what their actual snapshots of what their actual subset of stops look like in detail was, when we first saw the results, a mixed bag. One, in regards to 85% of the time being compliant with requirements as to the constitutionality of the stop, the engagement by the officer, but troubling in the few instances that we did see on the basis of the tactics that the officers employed. A very relaxed, or seemingly over-relaxed and lackadaisical approach, perhaps as a means of trying to, in their efforts or mine, win favor or de-escalate a situation, but in our view, specific to search tactics, truly undermining their safety, both their safety as well as the individuals in which they're encountering. Searches, for instance, must be lawful, whether it's based on consent or reasonable suspicion, and as such, an officer engaged in such a search, they need to be done properly so that the safety, again, of the officer as well as the people being searched and in that encounter is maintained and protected. We have seen tragically when in law enforcement such tactics are not regularly employed, that disaster results. Disaster results in the sense of the threat to the officer and loss of life, and or the actions of the person being searched or someone else in the group being misinterpreted, resulting in an officer using deadly force or other force because of perception that their safety is jeopardized. So the officer safety tactic was the first thing that came and caused us concern relative to the tactics. Again, a smaller percentage, but nonetheless one. If it's just one instance, it was one too many. Secondly was a documentation. The aspect of what was the officer's articulation, whether there was consent or it was a reasonable suspicion, needs to be concise. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be responsive to the question of, was this stop lawful? Was it constitutional? Was the officer's actions articulated so that a review of them would demonstrate that they were valid and reasonable? Lastly, in regards to procedural justice, I will say that in the videos that I saw, even the videos in which we fell short, I did note a sense of casualness about the officer's engagement that suggested an effort to have a conversation, an effort to enter into this dialogue that was less rigid than perhaps I would have seen 10, 15, 20 years ago by officers in similar assignments. So that aspect of approachability, I think, was noted. However, the aspect of a voice, being fair, articulating the basis for one's actions, closing out that encounter with an articulation of why the person was there and what took place, and also the issuance or offering of a business card to those that were detained or in the encounter. Those are all requirements that are existing requirements, and as such that I was disappointed again when we saw instances in which that standard was not met. So that's why I meant by a mixed bag, but I will say also the cooperation by the Inspector General in providing this information to us early, and my leadership team, who we met and we reviewed this, and it was unified in the sense of what we had to do, and that was to do a game stop to bring in our officers, both the GED as well as Metropolitan, and to provide a reinforcement of what our standards are. And in this instance, I was particularly thankful for the Inspector General for allowing us to actually use the actual videos themselves. And that was a powerful process, so that officers, as they watched the appropriate examples and demonstrations, and there were videos that were the Inspector General reviewed, that our officers' actions, as stated before, 85% of the time were compliant and were observant. But also those that fell short, and to allow the officers themselves and supervisors to see this conduct and to question themselves and to assert as a group how they viewed their scorecard in the sense of how our reaction was. So that was important. Many times these processes get bogged down because people, as they fall short in a standard, go into a personnel matter, and then people's rights and due process and so forth can bind us up as a department in our ability to use these very good examples, on both sides of the equation, as a learning tool. So I attended a portion of one of the training sessions, and I authored a brief video talking about the importance of this. And again, I'll close by saying that this has come on our radar with the actual data, but this has been an issue that the department has, in the last few years, been working on striking the balance of ensuring that our actions are understood, that we're fair, that we give voice to those that we encounter, and that our actions are trustworthy. We know we fall short of that. This was an example of how we did, and I think it's been used, and it will be used going forward as a means of accountability, as well as stressing what our standards are. Lastly, I applaud the actions of Chief Arcos and the Office of Operations, as well as the Office of Special Operations. They have already embarked on the next evolution, if you will, of inspections and controls at the local level and at the metropolitan level, so that what the Inspector General's office made occur over a course of a 2-month inspection, we will do monthly. And that, I believe, that wash, rinse, repeat, that process of looking at these videos, scoring them for this level of detail, is the next evolution of our inspection process. We have inspected videos in the past. Late activations, complete activations through the ordeal, and other tests have been there, but they've been much more superficial unless it was a critical incident involving a use of force, a pursuit, or a categorical matter. This next version, as we move into 2019, I believe, while intensive and costly in the sense of time, will benefit us immensely in reinforcing when people are acting appropriately and right, and when they fall short of that. So I think this has been it is a learning process for us, and a sobering one at times, and I look forward to the work that our people are capable of doing, and I know that the vast majority of time are engaged in. But for those who have fallen short, we've got to do it better.
Thank you, Chief. Also want to thank the Inspector General's office we've been working on this report for a long time and took a tremendous amount of effort and appreciate all the work that you put into producing a very useful report, as others have said. Also want to thank the chief and the department for taking such swift action early on to address these issues, as you have been doing for years, but particularly in response to the findings here, as you've detailed. And certainly there's been tremendous improvement on these issues over the last many years. I'm disturbed by the number of stops that are not reasonable or where we could not determine them, by the number of problematic searches, the issues with consensual stops and searches. I'm disturbed by the many more problems in stops and searches involving men of color, the problems with activation of body-worn video and digital in-camera and in-car video, and also disturbed by the incidences where we were not complying with procedural justice. As others have said, in the majority of cases, the stops are reasonable and the officers did what they're supposed to do. They have hard jobs, and they, in the majority of cases, are doing their jobs well. But I am disturbed by the incidences where that is not happening. I've personally been devastated by the impact of gang violence in my life and in my family's life. So I'm grateful for the department's and the community's diligence over the years to reduce gang violence dramatically. And I know that the gang enforcement units and proactive and suppression policing by the LAPD play a critical role in that. But we also know that the trust of police is unacceptably low among Black people. We know that negative encounters with the police on Black people, like those documented in this report, is damaging to their health and well-being, and that contact itself criminalizes people. And we know that following the policies as they're set forth also protects the safety of officers. So both of these things are true. And I know that the chief is facing these issues head on and working to create a balanced approach that continues to bring down crime in high crime communities while treating our residents with respect, dignity, fairness, and trustworthiness. I spent the day yesterday with the chief in South LA hearing from Black residents about their experiences with the LAPD. Many of them expressed gratitude for the work of the department to keep them safe. And many also shared stories like those in this report of unfair and unacceptable treatment by the LAPD. The chief listened, asked questions, and told them he's determined to fix the problems. The Inspector General recommendations are a good step in the right direction. They are appropriately focused on training and accountability. I absolutely expect these efforts to improve training and accountability will dramatically improve the quality of policing by the department. And I also know that it will take time to see the results of these steps. So I want to ask a few questions, and I'll just ask them all together, and mostly for the department, although the Inspector General can weigh in as well, and I'll just put them all out there and you can respond accordingly. So the first is, I'd like to hear how the department is continuing to address and reduce the impact of racial bias. The report raises questions about the strategy of proactive and suppression policing itself. So I'd like to understand how we can better calibrate to continue to reduce crime while minimizing the negative impact of those strategies on our residents. And finally, there's what the report doesn't touch on is really getting to the root causes of crime. And I know the chief and the department are committed to expanding community-based prevention, intervention, and diversion. So I'd like to hear more about how the department is doing this. How can we invest more in community-driven solutions and services like youth development and diversion, gang intervention and prevention, mental health services, and community policing?
Before we begin that, will you explain the process of how this audit was requested by the commission? Is it a regular audit that goes to the Inspector General? Was it a specific request of the commission?
This was a specific collaborative effort by the Inspector General and members of the commission to, in response to issues that we hear about from community members, about, I don't know, a year and a half ago under the previous Inspector General, and then the report was really done and finalized under Mr. Smith. Do you want to comment on that?
Only to add this, the effort initiated before my arrival, there was a bit of a pause in the changeover of Inspectors General. When I got here, I kind of saw what work was done, made sure we got it updated and a bit more current, and focused on a few more things. And with the help of the folks you heard from today, as well as a couple others in our office who really worked on this project, we brought it into a bit of more of a current, what I'll call a current state, and finished up and brought it here today.
Okay, thanks.
right, good morning, Commissioners, Chief Moore, Bob Arcos, and George Rodriguez from the Office of Operations. If I could, please just open up with some open remarks on behalf of the department to the Office of Inspector General's report. So on behalf of Chief Moore and the department, I appreciate the opportunity to respond to the Inspector General's report. This report reviewed a sampling of police-citizen encounters of 18 of our 21 GED units during the 2 months of July and August of 2018. It is the first time a systematic review of our officers' actions has been provided by the Office of the Inspector General since the department-wide implementation of body-worn video. As noted by the Inspector General, an overwhelming majority of police-citizen contacts had no issues, approximately 85%. However, other incidents fell short of our expectations. The report assessed 3 critical tenets of constitutional policing that included reverence for the law, adherence to our department policies, and commitment to procedural justice. Clearly, our commitment to protecting and serving demands that constitutional protections are paramount. While the vast majority of stops reviewed by the Inspector General found that our officers' actions were reasonable and legally justified, there were several police-citizen encounters involving detentions and searches that, based on the available video and officer logs, caused concern for the IG and for the department. Several areas of deficiencies identified by the Office of Inspector General included late activations, non-activations of DICV, insufficient documentation and basis for stop and or affirmative consent, insufficient articulation and for searches, and failure to provide business cards as required, and instances when the new AFDR guidelines were not followed. The OIG did acknowledge that overall GD officers were courteous in the majority of the stops reviewed. However, we both recognize that there were several missed opportunities for communicating the reasons for the stop and a better application of the tenets of procedural justice. Today, we have the tools that provide transparency and accountability, the use of body-worn video and in-car video, and a comprehensive automated field data reporting system. I believe that our GD officers have one of the most difficult assignments in the department. I know that we are all grateful for their courage, compassion, and commitment that our communities witness every day. I am confident in my belief and expectation we can do better and we will do better utilizing the tools and technology as intended. The department embraces this report as an opportunity for introspection, course correction, and improvement. We remain steadfast in our commitment to constitutional policing, procedural justice principles, and building trust and legitimacy. We appreciate the Office Inspector General's close communication and coordination regarding the identified deficiencies in this report, which allow the department to take a number of swift and measured actions that included updated legal and tactical training for over 400 gang and Metropolitan Division officers that included the use of body-worn video, documenting encounters with the new electronic AFDR system, officer safety and tactics, and an in-depth review of Fourth Amendment law and permissible searches of suspects. Before Commander Rodriguez covers each of the OIG recommendations with the department's specific actions taken, it is really important for you to know that the specific actions taken were completed through a very collaborative effort led by Chief Grimala, Chief Peters, Director Alakan, Director Pinnell, Commander Burt, and Mr. Rubenstein. The department has been incredibly responsive to every single issue that has been brought forth by the Office of Inspector General. If you would allow this also, Commissioners, I know that you had a list of questions we want to answer for you. But for the 9 recommendations that the Inspector General laid out, we have specific actions taken to each of the recommendations and brought down and sorted out by 4 categories, if that's okay?
Of course, yes.
Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, Chief. So as Chief Arco stated, we've taken all recommendations provided by the Inspector General, and we've kind of broken them up into 4 very distinct areas that we want to focus on. And the first one is with training. Specifically to the cornerstone training that we provided, which the Chief briefly talked about. This was a collaboration put together by all members of the organization, in which we brought all Metro and GD units together early on in the month of January and provided a 5-hour block of instruction covering a variety of topics. To include the refreshing and reemphasizing of previous policies that we currently have, 13 documents that we were able to extract. And we provided for an interactive and facilitative discussion amongst everyone that was in attendance. And as a matter of fact, we did have members of the Inspector General's team present on one of the trainings that was provided so that they can see what was being provided to the officers. And most importantly, and one of the biggest takeaway that we as an organization had from this training was the surveys that were completed at the conclusion of the training as a feedback mechanism from the officers as to how they gauged the training. It was overwhelmingly positive, and they were had very receptive feedback on the training that was provided to them. And as the chief stated, to further underscore and emphasize the importance of this training, he did open up each and every session with a video talking about not only the audit, but the importance of procedural justice and the importance that brings with building trust with our communities. So in addition to that training, and as the Inspector General earlier mentioned, as soon as we became aware of some of the deficiencies that they were noticing in the audit, right up front in the beginning, we conducted a conference call with all our Bureau commanding officers and directed them that each one of their area captains attend a GED roll call over that weekend. That happened over November 16th to November 20th. We had them to make sure that they discussed legal contacts, articulable basis, as well as officer safety. And in addition to that is to further reemphasize the activation of the body-worn cameras and the digital in-car video. In addition to that, we mandated that all GED roll calls be addressed, not only by the commanding officers, but they were read. All the documents that specifically dealt with the articulable basis and the stops and consensual encounters and those things. Secondly, and on the heels of that, the director for the Office of Constitutional Policing sent a message to all department employees, which specifically talked about pat-down searches, consensual encounters, reasonable suspicion, probable cause, further explaining what those concepts were and what the expectations of the organization was. In addition to that, so that was sent department-wide. We made an emphasis that this was also read to all GED roll calls between the period of November 26th through November 29th to ensure that everyone working GED, if they didn't get the original message, sent out by the director, it would be read to them in the roll calls. In addition to that, our training group developed a quarterly periodical that they will post. The first one was published in the month of January, which covered the topics of leadership, procedural justice, all the different tenets. It's a one-page document that is very inclusive, and again, that is going to be circulated on a quarterly basis. In addition to that, we've discovered a document that the DA puts out periodically called the 1-minute brief. And on the 1st of February, we found one specifically as it relates to searches of individuals who are subject to probation and AB 109. There is some confusion between the officers as to the difference between probation and AB 109 supervised release. So that was provided. There was a lot of clarity provided by the DA's office as it relates specifically to that and what the legalities behind the detentions and the searches are. So that was also circulated to the officers. In the packet of information and directives that were discussed at the training that the chief spoke on earlier, we also had an opportunity to, instead of just keeping that information central to the Metro GED, we circulated that to every member in the organization so that they can also take advantage of that information and those clarifying points as it related to the specific topics that are being discussed in this particular audit. And as a follow-up to the cornerstone training that we've discussed here, we are in the process of scheduling all GED supervisors to come back so that we can discuss their responsibilities, expectations, as well as the training received and the feedback that we received from the officers who attended the training. The second area for the recommendations, it specifically relates to audits and inspections, and we took 3 of the recommendations that we feel fall under that category. The first one, in conversations with Dr. Phillips, we do know that Audit Division is in the process of conducting an arrest booking and charge audit, which will be within Q2. That will be specifically looking at some of the issues that were addressed here in the IG's report. In addition to that audit, later on in the year, there will be 2 separate audits that will be conducted, one on digital in-car video and body worn, that will specifically address and look for some of the issues identified in this particular audit as it refers to stops, detention, searches, and also on the AFDR process. As you are well aware, this was a process that was started for us in the 1st of July, a more comprehensive with more data points, and they will also be looking at that process to ensure its completeness and adherence to the law as we do with the other audit. Also, as a supplement, our own inspection unit that we have at the Office of Operations, they will be supplementing some of these audits and endeavors that Audit Division is doing, and they will be conducting their own audits of body-worn digital in-car videos of stops, and that will also happen during the second quarter of 2019. And lastly, in this particular category, we are going to incorporate a monthly review process for supervisors to assess and evaluate stops for legality, documentation, and procedural justice protocols. This is something that they are currently not doing, but we will make sure that they do on a continual basis to assist in the overall assessment of our officers' actions. The third area would be the accountability piece, and there's a recommendation made there as far as accountability. As you're aware, we are currently in negotiations with our labor union to develop an accountability process that will track any breakdowns and actions taken for non or late activations of the digital in-car video systems of the body-worn cameras or early terminations of these devices. And in addition to that, we are also working at the Office of Operations, and we're in the process of standardizing the inspections, the documentation, and accountability that the 4 bureaus are currently undergoing. The next section and last one that we're looking at is the procedural justice, and it's a very important topic, which 3 recommendations fell under. And if, as a result of the earlier inspection in the month of July, August, and as it relates to 148, one of the first steps that we took is to instruct all watch commanders to document the reviewed videos as it relates to 148 arrest, and they need to document under watch commander's report what their determination was in the review of the tenets of procedural justice were followed. Shortly thereafter, in the month of October, our inspection unit went out and took a look and made sure that that was being documented. And we did find some deficiencies which they were notified and working to correct. But we are going to be doing another inspection of that process here within the next month. Training Division, we've been working with Dr. Pennell. They have updated just about every lesson plan that they have, which will now include blocks of instructions on procedural justice and the tenets that have been discussed here recently. Another important one that we feel it's gonna go a long ways. It's in conjunction with our video unit. We will develop a video that will be shown at all roll calls that is going to personalize and emphasize the tenets of procedural justice, specifically giving the community a voice, respect, neutrality, understanding, and helpfulness. And this is going to come down to the point where we're going to ask the officers, how would you expect your family members to be treated if detained by a member of an outside law enforcement agency? One that was that was new to us was the circulated the directives as it relates to the Social Security number disclosure, and this was sent out on the 1st of February. Our back office is currently doing a project researching the need or the necessity for us to include our Social Security number in our FI cards. If it is determined that is something that is necessary as part of a process, then it'll be included. But if we determine that it's not, that is a field that will be eliminated and will not be collected in any future contacts that we have with the community. And last but not least is the issuance of business card. This has been an area that we acknowledge we've had some struggles in the past. So we have taken our directives and manuals and we have spoken to our bureau chiefs. In fact, today on our direct reports, it'll be a topic of discussion. Basically to reemphasize to our personnel the need and the fact that they have to be distributed. So we're currently working to develop a system to formalize a consistent process of the expectations, the follow-through and the accountability for issuing these business cards. And we're hoping that by instituting this process, we will get better compliance rate and hopefully 100% compliance in the issuance of the business cards area. And that concludes some of the actions that we've taken as it relates to the recommendations from the Inspector General.
Pause before you get to the other questions. Just want to pause for a moment and commend, that tremendous list of initiatives that are already underway. I mean, as we've all said, in the vast majority of cases, the stops and searches were reasonable, but you have clearly demonstrated how seriously you take the instances where it was not and where there were problems, and to devote that amount of resources and effort throughout the department to address those issues is truly commendable. And I also appreciate the collaborative approach that the Inspector General's office took with the department to enable this type of quick response. And I'm glad to hear that you're collaborating with the union as well on the accountability measures to make sure that their voice is part of the process.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thanks for that's a very comprehensive approach and actions taken since November 16th, and now we're here February 5th. And these things are just not one-time rollouts. So this is going to be a recurring and consistent refining of these practices, and we'll continue to do so. I know you had a number of questions that you put out in the before we rolled out our statement. Just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, I think, some of the issues you talked about. What's the department doing to help reduce these feelings of bias, et cetera? I know the commission is very aware of the work that was done with Dr. Marks and the department going through the implicit bias training. The work that Chief Moore has undertaken with our gang enforcement units in Metropolitan Division, being more community-centric and being involved in community policing programs. I know Chief Grimala, under her leadership, has sent Metropolitan Division officers to community meetings in the areas. The gang units are now involved in community meetings and going to the community events. The gang officers are involved in Summer Night Lights, Friday Fall Nights. They're involved in the youth squad selection. So it's a number of things that are going on, especially from training as well, with the ongoing training on implicit bias that Dr. Pinnell is doing, and those that training on procedural justice as well. Those are continuing things that are happening with the organization that I help alleviate some of these issues. As the chief said very clearly, a handful of incidents, but it only takes one incident to erode trust, and that's what we're continuing to commit to ensuring that we don't have those issues. I know you had.
I wrote them down, Bobby. So okay. Chief Arcos. So in regards to the bias, what has been talked about here, I think it comes down to self-awareness, and department's continued emphasis in educating both our young officers as well as those with more tenure about the persistence of this matter of being aware of one's biases and acknowledging, first step, but also engaging in their actions day to day, and what does the organization engage in a persistent manner that improves social contact. The ability of our officers to have encounters that are more broadly defined than by an enforcement action, than by solely looking for an individual who's preying upon an area with violence. By having those officers and supervisors and the command mindful that those actions in isolation can have a deterring effect on even the officers' confidence in that fact that those other strategies do work. So we want and we'll look forward to the continued engagement. I'm encouraged by people such as Captain Al Labrada and his early intervention in this area and experimentation with his gang officers in the Hollenbeck area, actually having them go into communities and adopting families, if you will, in areas of a community that historically have been racked by gang violence. And his expectation of his men and women in the gang enforcement detail that it is their responsibility to have that similar engagement. We have talked within the office and with Chief Arcos and his oversight as well as his bureau chiefs as to the tenure of our gang officers, and that as we look to this timed, limited duration assignment, extension should be granted for those that have demonstrated a broader range of awareness and their engagement in these type of community engagement efforts much more than just simple enforcement. On a more broader stage, because this is not just about GED, this is a snapshot into proactive police work involving in this instance GED, followed by Metro, but also rank and file officers, traffic officers. What are their actions in the sense of fairness, voice, neutrality, being trustworthy? That's where I'm encouraged and by the efforts of Chief Peters and by Deputy Chief Baeza and them developing a weekly series of video vignettes now that go to these very issues. And a persistence. Just yesterday we spoke with our general staff meeting about the persistence of good examples of officers engaged in regularly having trust building actions and not solely tactics. But that balance, I think, is the persistence sets the standard. Obviously, the department's use of strategies such as youth diversion, pre-arrest diversion, the expansion of that. It started in South Bureau under the leadership of then Deputy Chief Green. It expanded the Valley Bureau, and now we're in 15 of the 21 areas. It had been limited, if you will, by community-based organizations and their ability to really engage in those families. And I'm encouraged that with the county's support that we're going to see an expansion of community-based organizations that can engage with us. I'm also encouraged that 4 years ago, when this initiative first started, there was a great deal more resistance than today. I think that many of our people today recognize the value. This has been brought on also, I think, by criminal justice reform in the last 6 to 7 years, that our detectives and our officers are seeing it is much better to have a successful outcome than a booking number. And so and their desire of that as well. The expansion of the Community Safety Partnership in South Bureau in Newton Division of South Los Angeles in the San Fernando Garden, I've been recently approached and asked if we can expand it further. And I will say, as did Chief Beck, this is a strategy that is good and healthy for neighborhoods. It's good and healthy for the department and officers that are engaged in that. And as we see that resources can be brought that would allow us to expand into additional neighborhoods, I believe, just as we look at grid zones across all the city, that we have CSP as a strategy that can be throughout the city and not limited to where it's at today. And even our initial our expansion this year at these 2 additional sites, I'm open and looking forward to further support that will allow us to go with this strategy into more additional neighborhoods. Lastly, in regards to this, again, implicit bias, this matter of procedural justice, is the leadership, again, with the development of PSL 1, PSL 2, and what will come after that is a PSL 3, police science leadership courses that are geared towards these very contemporary subjects that take officers in service. And so this is not just classroom-based, but is in-service training with officers who have experience in the field and bringing them back into scenario-based training that, again, reinforces good police work, solid tenets of what we expect of our personnel. Lastly, in regards to your question about proactive and the balance, this is an area that we recognize. I said yesterday in the Watts Gang Task Force, the reduction of violent crime, the reduction of gang crime, last year a reduction of 20% fewer gang homicides, is a success of every partner that we have in every community that's engaging in efforts to intervene and stop the senselessness of gang violence. And at the same sobering time, while we see some of the safest crime levels in decades, last year 140 people were killed by gang violence and over 700 individuals were shot. 700 out of just over 1,000 shooting victims that were gang related. And so with those reductions, we still have a persistent and very dangerous circumstance of gangs still having an impact in our communities. So proactive strategies, investigative strategies, efforts to identify those individuals who are preying upon others are important matters, and matters that cannot be trivialized or marginalized that this is now done. We should be more in community engagement than this aspect of crime suppression and crime and seeking out those involved. But we recognize that one bad example, one abuse of its discretion, has a much larger impact on community trust than a reduction of 5 fewer shooting victims. That is what spreads, is that when we get it wrong. And so we are committed to that balance by having strategic efforts that are beyond crime suppression, that crime suppression through prevention, crime suppression through innovative strategies that go to the root of crime. And to that end, I was asked yesterday about our support of such other strategies that are not police-centric. I started my tenure as chief with this concept that policing, that public safety is a shared responsibility, that it is not a police responsibility, it is all of our responsibilities. And I remain committed, whether it's gang violence or homelessness or other challenges and crises of our generation, to having that balanced approach and advocacy for other services. Mental health workers, I'm encouraged by the leadership on this commission of expanding 911 beyond police and fire, to expanding it to include mental health workers and engagement of organizations that can respond to those crises in place of law enforcement. I'm encouraged to support gang reduction youth development resources, our support of Ms. Tremblay and the mayor's office, and the expansion of Summer Night Lights under the leadership of Mayor Garcetti, of Friday Night Lights, of jobs programs, and of ambassadors. Those are all strategies that have my full-throated support, and we will take every opportunity to demonstrate that. That is not rhetoric. That is a matter of trying to elicit from a policing standpoint the fact that we need those other efforts at the table that will allow us to certainly focus on the most serious and most critical issues of violence, and allow these other resources into those neighborhoods to make the lasting difference. Hopefully that's begun to address some of those questions.
Thank you, Chief. Commissioner Bonner, as the other member of the subcommittee, would you like to ask some questions?
Yes, I would, and just say some of them probably go to the four corners of the audit, and some may be just do a little bit of background. But first, question in terms of the scope of the audit. It's my understanding that this was 300 GED cases that were the subject of this audit, and there's roughly 200 or 250 officers in the crime suppression unit in Metro, thereabout. First question I'm looking at, or I'm wondering, is how broad this look really is. There's 10,000 officers in the department, and there's roughly 500 or so that might be subject to this conversation. Is there some other way that we're going to have some understanding about the behavior or the activity of the other 9,500 officers who make stops? I mean, that's my first broad question.
Yeah, you want to take that, or I'll take that? Yeah. So Commissioner Bonner, that was definitely an area that's going to be included in all the things that we're rolling out with GED, and that have been rolled out with Metropolitan Division. But for the purpose of this audit, that was focused on GED. We kept our remarks to the focused recommended actions that we did with GED. But as far as the rest of the department, it goes across the board. And every one of our officers that are carrying body-worn video or having contacts in the field will be subject to the same recommended actions that we've listed.
So, the first question I think is maybe an observation also to the commission, or a suggestion that we. I know this is the first of the two audits that are coming, but I don't think that we should consider the work done. Again, to me, looking at 500 officers out of 10,000 doesn't really tell me that much, and so I would just suggest that we continue thinking about how we can look more broadly to across the department.
Commissioner, if I could as well, just as far as the Office Inspector General goes, so our office, and in particular our audit division, which presented this report today, our audit section, has broad authority to really look at any aspect of the department. We do so oftentimes on issues that seem of concern to us, or we've looked at in the past and want an update, but even more frequently do so in response to commission requests. One example of that was our previous audit that we presented to this commission on stops of 148, so resisting or obstructing an officer, which was a broader look at the department. But the main point of this is to say that any direction the commission wants to give us is saying we'd like to see more of this. That's what we're here to do.
Yep, I appreciate that.
And Commissioner, I would add, go ahead, Bobby.
Go ahead, Chief.
You want to talk about the Bureau audits of the ongoing persistent audits of the more broadly of all the other units?
Yeah, and to the Chief's comments earlier, Commissioner Bonner, the Bureau inspection units and how they're set up really have just taken, really, as he said, a superficial look at late activations or non-activations and transportations of suspects in the vehicle. We need to expand that. We have police performance auditors that are very well trained and excellent auditors. We just need to expand that to these other issues that have been discussed in the Inspector General's report, which we're looking to do as well.
Okay.
One of the points here that I want to draw home is that this was 91 videos. Currently, the audit scheduled by the geographic bureaus are testing hundreds of videos each month to the tune of 800, 1,000, 1,500. The challenge with the volume is that that's much more representative. That's a statistically representative of the 4 conditions that they look for. This is a qualitative audit, meaning that it digs into the actual conduct that goes on beyond those 4 testing. The department will look to, and I think it's fair that we look qualitatively at our patrol units and traffic, just as we have with GED and Metro. And how do we do that? I don't think it can be as deep and as expansive as what we're doing with the 4 tests, but we need to be persistent in it because I believe that as that happens, we'll see a better understanding of how representative this work is, and also accountability in the sense of ensuring that if we fall short or as people fall short, that we identify it and move forward with it.
I appreciate that. I think because the main point is that I don't think anybody thinks that the fundamental issue that we're talking about in terms of fairness and the treatment of people is limited to these 2 relatively small parts of the department. So I just want to make sure that we're clear about that. I have some other just kind of more specific questions. The first one comes up on page 15 of the audit report. This is relative to the explanation of the reason for stops and related searches, and there's in the second paragraph there, it indicates that the department doesn't have a specific policy requiring officers to provide a reason for additional actions taken during stops, such as searches. So if someone is maybe there's probable cause or reasonable suspicion to stop someone, but it sounds like there's no policy that says that guides the officer's behavior relative to additional actions. Is there a reason for that, or is there a reason why there's a open space there relative to that policy, or is it something else that might be worth looking at?
Policy, right. Yeah. So there is an expectation that everyone is explained for the reason for why they're detained. That's all part of the procedural justice tenets that were included. But as for the open space from the Office of Inspector General, there is not a policy that specifically delineates that action. But it is definitely an expectation for everyone who is stopped or encountered by the police that there is an explanation that is given.
What I'm asking is there any reason why there could not be or should not be a policy on that?
I don't believe that there is not a specific reason about why. But
I noted that as well, and not to question the report of is it written down someplace, but explain why you're there as tactically at the appropriate time. Officers cannot always explain why they're doing and the authority that they have to do what they're ordering individuals to do. At an early juncture, but once things are reached a certain point of security and tactics or the people are safe, certainly at the end of the stop, the justification for and the articulation of why the individual stopped and what the circumstances were that allowed the actions taken, that is an absolute requirement. It's consistent with our training, and we will go back and identify source documents to validate that, because brushing someone off is a term of a phrase that has existed in policing for decades, and that goes to the point of it speaks to the fact of once you get them back up off the ground because you've had to search them and order them and say a high risk search, that you still provide the explanation at the end of why you did that and if the person disagrees, they have the ability of a supervisor to come and the admonishment by the officer to admonish people that if you have a question or concern or problem with what I've done, I can call a supervisor. The nature of the business card itself is also to allow the individual, should they feel that their service provided was inadequate or wrong, was to take for the department to initiate an investigation. So those are wrapped up in how we go about our policing, but we'll circle back with the source document of how that's best defined.
Yeah.
Okay, and again, just to be clear, the specific question I'm also wanting to understand is, in some cases, we may suggest that we look at a policy on X, Y, or Z, and there may be a very rational law enforcement reason why having a policy on that issue is not a good idea.
Right.
That it's better to leave it to discretion or better to leave it open. So that's the first question I'm really asking is, whether there's a reason why. I'm not suggesting that we are going to go out and fashion a policy, but it's something I think should be considered. So I just want to be clear as to why it is an open space and whether it's an area that we can look at. The next question is coming up, and this is on page 18. This is relative to asking for Social Security numbers. And I think, was I understanding you correctly to say that there may be some phasing out of this this question?
That is correct, Commissioner. We're currently researching the need to have that Social Security number documented. Is it part of the 9 lines necessary when someone gets arrested, or is it just a data point that we've collected over the years? So we're looking into that and see what the need for it is.
One of the just questions I have here, but also concerns is when you have a situation like this where, if I'm reading this correctly, the officer is required to give this relatively boilerplate response, or so it says that if you're asking for a Social Security number, that the following disclosure statement is made. Federal law requires that you be informed when asked for your Social Security number that it must be provided for use and identification. Authority for requiring this information is based upon field interview procedures operational prior to January 1, 1975. Yep. I mean, is there anybody in here who would make sense of any of what, particularly the second part of that means? I mean, how would the person on the street make any sense of what the
I want to give credit to the chief of police. Chief of police recalled this in the manuals. This, as you cited, it was 1975 that this was enacted and placed in there. But there's we adjust and make modifications to the field interview cards. We've just recently done that and taken the place of birth out. Union affiliation was another thing that we just removed. So if there is really no identifiable value out of having the Social Security number listed on the field interview card, then we will be making a recommendation to remove that as well.
We're going to closely examine. Social Security number obviously can be used in identity theft. It is the 50 years ago, it was the unique identifier for an individual, and its confidentiality was protected, and this was a regulation that is still in effect. But like just as place of birth is no longer asked on field identification cards because of a lack of a need for it, absent an arrest situation, a booking, and then we're going to ask it differently. We're going to look and do the same test here for this.
I think, and that sounds fair. One thing I would just, it may be that you no longer have to ask the question, or if you do, the question then I think would be whether there's anything closer to plain language or plain English that could be described. I mean, one of the things, even as a commissioner, it's very difficult. First, you have to come here and you have to first learn the language, the vernacular of law enforcement, and then we have at least the opportunity to work with it all week and so on. But when you're talking about someone who's just doing their day-to-day, business and is stopped and trying to understand all of the technicality that we deal with, I think everything we can do to put that in plain English for otherwise intelligent people, I think would be a good thing to do. I wanted to go on back then to some of I already expressed there's on page 18, there's a discussion about how small this group of stops was, and so we talked about that. I want to just understand some more about that along the lines I asked. I wanted, going back now to towards the recommendations, and there's some of these sound to me to be somewhat at least related, if not overlapping. And in the big picture, what it seems to me is that we're going to make a massive effort to just remind people what the rules are and encourage them to do better. Am I missing something in that regard in terms of what the thrust of the recommendations are?
Are you talking about the directed actions from the department to the recommendations of IG? Yeah, it is. It's reminding, it's clarification, it's the reinforcement, the emphasis again of following the rules and following the department policy, very strictly.
But importantly, in strategic, if it was just reinforcement, I don't think that we would get the desired results. That's why the office is directed each gang enforcement detail on a monthly basis. The supervisor will take a randomized sample of stops, matching the criteria, much as has been described here by the Inspector General, at that local level. And review the videos. Same optics. That is a material difference. We currently do such reviews on all critical events such as the use of force or pursuit, those type of matters. But we have not habitually done that. It's a quality service audit is how this is done prior to body-worn videos. And I believe that in each of the geographic areas, the GEDs, the most meaningful way of impacting this is by showing our work. And by supervisors seeing the work, they can better understand areas of training, areas of motivation, areas of compliance and excellence when they watch their personnel, when they're not in the field, out with them in the field. What is the conduct of their officers? This was clear when we saw the vast majority of instances in which things were compliant. It's a relatively simple test. You watch it and it says, yeah, this is how this works. When we fell short, it was also dramatic. It was clearly, we saw search techniques and communications that it wasn't a gray area. This fell short. Now I was thankful that what fell short wasn't based on anger, wasn't based on assaultive or abusive language. It was based on just what I view is too casual of a nature and too haphazard of a manner in which officers conduct themselves. And so fixing that was a matter of tightening up, again, some habits that perhaps got developed or allowed to flourish that an intervention by a supervisor will correct very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's one of the most significant changes as well, Commissioner, to the expectation with the GD supervisors to review the body-worn video for legal basis, articulation, and documentation. And we will formalize it at the area level to ensure, again, the compliance of that.
Okay, Commissioner, if I could, one other area for us as far as our recommendations go, in addition to just sort of the reinforcement of these principles, is also to really effectively use the amount of data that the department now collects. And so the AFDR, which now has some 40 plus fields of information regarding every detention, up from what was previously somewhere around 11, I believe. It's more information to be looked at and to see where problems arise, where red flags arise. And the same thing with body-worn video. Now that all the field units out in the department have body-worn video and are required to comply with it, we want the department to use that data.
So speaking of data, so the next question comes up in regard to recommendation number 3 on page 26. That's the recommendation is to continue to develop a system to analyze data. And then it notes that there was a request by the commission in May of 2017 to along these lines in an effort to identify disparate treatment or other issues. The question is, what's the status of that, and why is it almost now 2 years in that we're if this is written as if it's something that we're still trying to develop?
I'm going to ask Mr. Allen to kind of step forward, but let me just frame that the analysis of stop data is a field that has had a great deal of research, and academia and others come in to weigh in about what that data means and doesn't mean. And there's not consensus in the criminal justice field, in the civil rights field. This is a very area of contention. But I do look forward, would like to hear from Mr. Alicon to further describe what we're doing in an effort to, we have to land this at some point. At some point we still, with the first 6 months behind us now, with RIPA, we now have a data set. And we do need to come up with a framework that begins to make some observations.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because otherwise, if the picture is as you're describing, and I have a reason to believe that it is, then the likelihood is that we'll still be here 6 months from now or a year from now, that we'll be continuing our efforts to try to develop this system to analyze data. And it does seem to me that at some point we'll just need to make some decisions, right, as to at least what the policy and perspective of this department is and how we'll analyze data. So did you have a good answer to that?
I'll leave the characterization of it being good to you.
Okay,
but,
let's give it a shot.
I think it's important, just a little bit of history on this, is that the LAPD started collecting extensive data during the consent decree. And actually the city paid for an outside group of researchers to come in and analyze that data. It would cost approximately $1 million. And it was very sophisticated, what we would call a multivariate analysis of both disparities in stops and disparities in post-stop data. And what they discovered, especially because they used a more sophisticated methodology, is that it is very difficult to infer any racial bias, especially when you look at different factors like the location, like potential, the perceived threat, et cetera. In 2017, when this came up again, we actually collected less data than we did during the consent decree, and that was through, I believe, agreement with the Department of Justice at the time, because there was limited value that they had seen at the time for collecting more robust data. Now that has changed. most recently last year as part of the new state law, and we are collecting much more data, much more extensive data that we are hoping to try to analyze. I think what's the caution that the chief was alluding to is that I think there's sometimes these what we would call maybe overly simplistic analyses of just taking what the mix of different races and ethnicities of those stopped and comparing it to census data of the residential population. And that has clearly been through academics and researchers that indicated that that is just a flawed analysis. Just last week, we had one of the premier experts on analyzing racial profiling data here for a conference, somebody I've been consulting on this issue, and we're going to explore looking at other research right now to see if there's something we can do with the new set of data that we're collecting as part of the new state mandate. But it is complicated, especially in terms of whether you can infer or have any causation or correlation with any bias, because it's a human interaction. Dr. Phillips, who does our audits and is very familiar with the methodology, and I believe may have been here at the time that we did that analysis, can address it further if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I don't. For this purpose, I don't think it's necessary. I mean, my own view at the end of the day, this is not really going to be a data-driven issue. I mean, I don't think we need data to establish that there is and continues to be an issue in this area, right? And I don't think that the data ultimately is going to prove or disprove one way or the other. That's just my own view of it. So I think it's helpful to continue the exercise, and I would appreciate in the appropriate context, whatever that is, the report on what has occurred since 2017. But I don't want to overstate the idea that we're going to bring forward data and establish one way or the other that our work is done. Let me just get through my last couple of questions so that in case any other commissioners have some questions here. The one question, you have all of these areas where we're going to do additional training and so on. There was also mentioned in the audit that these officers that go into these units are specifically trained and so on. So how much of what we're including here is already included in the training that these officers get when they first come into the program?
Certainly. I'm not sure what comes in. I know Metropolitan Division has a 4-week school that they go through, and I think Dr. Pennell would be able to know specifically. A lot of the law that's being taught is from the academy throughout and reminders. Ironically, the state of California doesn't require legal update training as part of its post requirements, its perishable skills, but the department is trying to fill that gap. And so we are doing not just specific training for the officers, but reminders and looking at different cases and using those. And one thing that was a little different, because I personally did the 2 hours of Fourth Amendment training for 4 of the 5 classes. It was not only just a reminder and a refresher of what the Fourth Amendment requires, what department policy requires, but also how they use their new tool, the body-worn video, to capture the basis and the reasons for the search. I think, as was pointed out in the report, many of these situations you couldn't tell what the basis was, whether it was consent or reasonable suspicion. And we're really trying to emphasize to the officers to see the cameras as a benefit and not a burden, especially when it comes to what the reasons were that were objective and fact-based, that form the basis so we can actually tell from the video rather than having to piece it together, even with the logs. So that's, I think, a new dimension to the way we're training, and we plan to do that to more now that we have full deployment of the body-worn cameras.
Okay. The last thing then I want to come back to is just to the point of accountability, so that as that term was used in a couple of the speakers today. What is really, again, my sense of this is that that the recommendations and the discussion here really is about reminding people to do the job better, reminding people what the requirements are, and kind of encouraging and cajoling people to do it better. What is it, or at what point would any given, there's two areas I'd be concerned about. One is at the officer level. At what point would there be some disciplinary or other more specific accountability? Because I don't read interpreting and encouraging people to refresh and training. That doesn't sound like accountability in my mind is someone takes an action, there's a consequence. So the first question to the chief or whomever is, at what point, and this, hypothetically, but I'm saying in a situation like this, I'm not asking whether there was a case in this audit, but in a situation like this, one question is, at what point is there potentially some disciplinary accountability on the behalf of the officer? Second part of that question is, when you go on up further the chain of command, where does that accountability lie here? So we've identified a couple of areas where we have found the greatest problem in terms of the areas of the city. At what point is it a chain of command issue, and where does that accountability lie in that process as well?
So this was referenced in passing by Chief Arcos that since 2015, the department has been operating under an agreement with the Los Angeles Police Protective League as to circumstances in which the requirements of the body-worn video were not followed. There was protocols in the sense of reaching this agreement as to how there'd be a 90-day transition period and what steps would be allowed during that period of time. And then in the aftermath of that, when shortfalls were occurred, that there would be progressive discipline, that there could be an investigation and corrective action could be taken and would be taken. Then what has happened in the last 4 years, 3.5 years, is that our geographic areas and bureaus, as well as Metro and people who use body-worn, have...
Just to clarify, so I understood that comment also relative to body-worn. I'm not asking when does someone get in trouble if they don't turn their video on or off at the appropriate time. I'm asking someone who is making improper stops or not following the protocols during those stops. Okay. I'm asking at what times their behavior relative to the individual that's being stopped result in some accountability.
So we have taken and will take action, and taken disciplinary action for those type of failures. This happened under my watch, and it's happened and has occurred under Chief Beck's watch. We have a quarterly disciplinary review that announces all of the cases that we publish internally. It's certainly available for the commission for review. We investigate an improper stop, detention that was unlawful. If alleged, we will investigate it, and if found true, then looking at the conduct and the severity of it, as well as the background of the officer involved, determine what's the appropriate course of action. Is it training, remedial training, or is it warranting more stringent and corrective action, including discipline, which could be an official reprimand, suspension, could be a removal, depending on the severity. I believe that, I am aware as chief signings and have signed and disciplined officers for what I've described here, and I know that as has Chief Beck. Where we're going here now is because of it, up to this point, inconsistent ways in which these inspections were done that weren't brought to our attention by a complainant, but were just buried in amongst the volume of these videos. We're now, as we come upon those and look at them, formalizing a system so that we can systematically investigate and determine the appropriate course of action and cause the area and bureau commands to be accountable to what the decision was as to what that corrective action is. Because that goes to your second point, is if at an area an officer falls short and it's a matter of he or she's remediated or corrective actions taken because this remediation should not have been necessary. The tenure and basis of the failure is such that corrective action is the appropriate step, not further training or further emphasis. But when those things persist in an area, then what systemic issues are? What's going on with supervision in that command? What's going on with the bureau or the involved area command as to their oversight of those failures? That's why, and is embedded in why we've asked for areas GED sergeants to be accountable to them looking at these stops, because I'm very interested in their corrective action at a supervisory level at the lowest point at the field level, so that they correct little problems before they become big problems. And as supervisors do that, that's the benefit of supervision. If, however, we were to find, and we have had supervisory failures in the past, where they look at this and say, I see nothing, everything's fine. And then some later review finds that, no, you should have seen the errors as we have. And we find the supervisor has acquiesced to that. Then corrective action will involve that supervisors. We have had, unfortunately, such failures. We have demoted supervisors for failing in their responsibilities, and that can extend to command officers as well.
Okay, thank you. That's all by way of questions. Just the comment I would just close with is I think within the four corners of this audit, there's just the number of questions that we reviewed. But on the bigger picture issue, it's my sense that this is simply one element of the conversation, that it's looking at a relatively small number of cases in regard to a relatively small number of officers in a large department. I just think that there's going to be I don't want us to think that we've got a long list of recommendations. You've had a good presentation on things that are already underway, and that has the potential to create the appearance of acting, taking action as best we need to. But I think you would agree that there's a lot more that we still can do, and therefore should be doing, and not limit ourselves to the four corners of this review.
The significance of this, Commissioner, points well taken. We're keeping this in perspective. But historically, our gang enforcement details and metropolitan details, they do have some of the toughest work out there. We task them with efforts to make a difference in communities, and involved in that is their proactive stance and their engagement. Historically, we're well aware that in some of our darker chapters, these are two of our work units that have also been involved in serious misconduct or fallen short, and has brought the entire organization to undermine the trust in the entire organization. So the significance of this is that this is proactive activity. This is some of the hardest work in order to judge, because officers are operating under a reasonable suspicion standard, and matters of what's allowed and not allowed by the Fourth Amendment. And in their application of that in hundreds of cycles, we want to make sure that they have the resilience to perform by our standards. Officers who are handling a radio call or otherwise tasked have less discretion in their day-to-day. These officers have nearly all of their discretion. And so as such, I think it's an area that's ripe for us to take a good understanding of. But again, we will keep this in perspective, that this is not representative of the entire organization.
It's a good place to start for
It
the
is.
reasons you're suggesting. So thank you.
Any additional questions from the commission?
Commissioner Decker?
Thank you. Good morning. And thank you to my fellow commissioners for asking so many questions. It has limited the number of questions I anticipate asking, although it may appear that I'm rehashing some things that have already been covered, but I don't intend to. I'd like to start, while Director Alarcon, you're at the table, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I want to go back to recommendation number 3 that Commissioner Bonner was talking about. And I will say, of course, I was also surprised to see May 2017, and you explained some of the complexities in developing a system to analyze data, but obviously the data presented here and in other reports gives great concern to the commission, to members of the community, and certainly to the police department, I'm sure. But being able to analyze the data and understand what it means is critically important to not just understanding it, but addressing concerns of the community, but also addressing the issues that have to be addressed in the department. Can you explain a little more the efforts being undertaken by the department to work on that, some of the challenges faced? I'm just trying to understand the complexity a little better.
Certainly. So oftentimes when these analyses are done, or when the data has been collected, it's simply looked at basically one variable and compared it to another. What was the race or ethnicity of the person stopped, and what is the race or ethnicity population according to the census, and then they draw inferences from that disparity. Well, that's not an accurate way to do that, because simply because somebody lives in the city doesn't necessarily mean they're subject to being stopped. Also, it's not necessarily representative of the population that may be in the area where the police officers are policing. In addition, when the officers are making a stop and they are doing as they are required to under the law, they shouldn't be taking race into account at all. It should always be based on the objective facts and circumstances to reasonably suspect that they're involved with criminal activity. And there are many different factors in why an officer would pull somebody over, including what the person was doing, what the circumstances were, et cetera. So the reason I lay that out is because oftentimes the disparities that you sometimes see are that simple comparison, which is, I don't think you'll find a police department in the country that would have equally matched percentages of stops compared to its residential population, especially a large city that is as diverse as we are. So we've been looking at and there have been many other studies of racial disparity and trying to look at this data, including the one that was done of the LAPD back in 2005 and there's been a lot of recent research on trying to do that when it comes to officer-involved shootings. And it's a complex problem that researchers are struggling with to be able to use that data and what can you determine by it. The thing that we are a bit hamstrung by, but we're trying to address, is that the data elements that are required to be recorded by the state statute were defined by them. For example, you must put down what your perception of is not just of race and ethnicity, but gender and a variety of other factors, language fluency, et cetera. There is no option that's allowed to say you could not determine. That's a methodological flaw because basically it forces the officers to try to guess. We're trying to work with the Department of Justice to change that because if we're going to use that data, we have to take that into account. The other thing that we have added to our data collection that's not required is a question: could you determine the race or ethnicity of the individual prior to initiating the stop? Because what often happens is they may not know ahead of time, and we're collecting that data to see if it's an impact. It is a very complex issue, especially to draw some causality or just to be able to infer from the disparity, but we're not stopping. We're in very constant discussions with researchers. I'm actually going to be at a conference of the Western Society of Criminologists on Friday, and we'll be talking to many of the researchers there and looking at ways that we can take the existing data and maybe supplement it with other things to come up with some way to use it. But it's just one of those unfortunate situations where we're required to report certain types of data by state law, and we have limited capability internally to do a sophisticated analysis. As I mentioned, it cost almost $1 million to do it under the consent decree. So it's not something that we could just run some numbers on our own.
Okay,
We're undeterred, though. we continue to do that.
I appreciate you're undeterred. I also think complex problems are sometimes critically important to solving,
Absolutely.
and we need to obviously address it. I appreciate the efforts that you're undertaking. I'm sorry, Doctor, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Perhaps just to add to the complexities is just in the sampling methodology, just to give you an idea, it takes a much larger sample to go ahead and conduct a study of a multivariate analysis with the dependent and independent variables. An example here, we're looking a sample for a population such as in this report, probably looking at about 500 or 600 of these cases that would have to be analyzed, not 91. We've had this discussion before about the one-tail test and two-tail test and the binary measurement. Notwithstanding the fact that this sample was appropriate to look at that binary measurement, was a reasonable suspicion, was a probable cause, the searches, but to try to infer any correlation or causation, that wouldn't be appropriate. That sample size wouldn't be appropriate.
I should add, though, in terms of statistics, we are trying to look at all the statistics we have. For example, we track very closely biased policing complaints, in particular with GAD and Metro, to see if there are any increases, decreases, how that is going. And of course, we track and thoroughly investigate any evidence of explicit bias, any inappropriate comment, any workplace comment, any sexual or other discrimination are things that we are looking at. And I think now, because of the body worn, which enabled the IG to do this thorough analysis and be able to see, we will be taking advantage of that too to find specific instances where we can make sure that people are being held accountable or have directed training for that particular issue.
All right, thank you. Clearly a complex problem, but one we have to get down to. But I do agree with Commissioner Bonner's comments earlier about we may perhaps figure out the proper analysis, but it doesn't diminish in any way the issues that have to be addressed. Changing subjects, thank you both very much, I appreciate that. Changing subjects slightly with respect to the report. I appreciate the great efforts that the department has taken to conduct training very quickly once the issues were presented by the IG, but this has been addressed slightly, but I wonder if someone can go into more detail on the continuous training that will happen, in part because GED is a unit that has turnover, that there's limited terms of for the individuals who are assigned to those units. And also, as with any organization, when you are reacting to something, there's that initial effort to address it, and then maybe over time other issues become more dominant and prevalent and of concern, and maybe this training becomes less of a priority. I'd like to know what the department will be doing to ensure it remains a continuous priority for the GED offices, the Metro officers, and my subsequent question will be then for patrol officers as well.
I'll start,
Outside
Commissioner.
of training in the academy.
Yeah, I'll start, Commissioner, just by the composition of the training that was provided during those 4 days with Metro and GED. There was a lot of feedback about we need to do this more, and this was not just coming from the instructors, this was coming from the participants, the officers from GED and Metro
And by the
and
way,
instructors.
Chief, I heard that as well from
Okay.
participants who really thought the training was excellent and asked for more.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. We just weren't sure. We just weren't sure what the feedback was going to be on that. It definitely was very open and facilitated discussion and breakout groups to hear from the officers and kind of get them engaged in this process. And what Dr. Pinnell was able to do was kind of orchestrate the training in a very, I think, a very sequenced orchestration of the training that worked very, very well. And from that, we started talking again about how we can do reoccurring training with this, and to include the GED supervisors that we talked about that we're bringing back in February to set up additional training for the supervisors only. But I'll let Dr. Pinnell talk about the training going forward.
Thank you, Chief. So when we started with this training, we wanted to look at helping officers even being able to evaluate their own, since we're utilizing body video so much more, the lens that we want them to look at it through. So you would hear this consistently throughout the training, the legal perspective and policy perspective. Am I operating properly out of that perspective? And then when I look at the video, certainly I want to look at a tactical perspective about safety for myself, my partners, and the community. And then additionally on mission, vision, values, the public perception. How does this look? Have I done all the things that I need to regarding procedural justice? And I think even the term procedural justice, even though we have trained and talked to officers about that, integrating that into their thinking and assessment process is kind of another step that we are kind of emphasizing this year. So that and I think that will be part of, as we go and meet with the supervisors, is giving them that lens when they're looking at body-worn video, not to just default to the tactical piece, which is consistent with how we've operated before. We know that that's an important piece, but we don't want that to be solely the only piece. So retraining officers to be, or the supervisors in particular, to be looking at through the various other lenses as well. And I think that part is what you would see consistent through the development of our training. So we certainly train in the academy, but that's in an environment that is, without people in it. So that is why the Police Sciences and Leadership Program was created, to develop a framework for the first 5 years. And so that's the development of PSL 1, 2, and 3, bringing them back out at 11 months, then bringing them back 2 years later and 2 years later. And that would be consistent with the post cycle as well, and give them work together as their class, bringing their class back to do that. So, but we will continue to have that legal dimension, the tactical dimension, and also the procedural justice and mission, vision, values dimension emphasized through every training. So what we're trying to get away from somewhat, and we saw this in the consent decree where we had a one-day training on one topic, but then the emphasis and what was a best practice at that time and continues to be is then you want to infuse that into all the key areas of other places where they get it in training. We also want to emphasize, and we saw this when we did this with de-escalation. We started with a training on de-escalation, and then we move it and we improve all our source documents. We make sure that the messaging is consistent from the chief in a video or in different various meetings, and from the command staff all the way through. And then we want to ensure that officers will continue to touch on these topics over and over. So we did that in the consent decree, and so consistently now, each time a new topic comes up, we try to give the first inoculation, if you will, to the whole department, and then to see how we can ensure that it's infused in future trainings, but also either through promotional exams and also questions for promotion and things like that. We give more of a consistent message. It's not just a training message. It's training, it's promotions, it's command officers all the way through.
Commissioner, what I also want to talk about is that Chief Moore from the first day he's taken over has really emphasized the use of body-worn video for training and for education for our officers. We just have not been doing a good enough job of using that as the tool and the value that it adds for the officers. So we're really looking, moving forward, is really reinforcing the confidence in the officers and our supervisors to understand the value of that body-worn video technology and DICV. It's tell your story is what we continually are putting out to our officers. Allow that technology to tell your story. Allow it to narrate what you're seeing, what you're doing, and using that for evidentiary value to help support your legal basis and to help support your documentation articulation. So we're really looking for that in this next iteration of our training as well.
I definitely appreciate that you're allowing the supervisors to, after, as you say, the initial inoculation, initial training, to allow the supervisors to take charge, which is their responsibility. At the same time, I'm concerned because GED in particular has the turnover, fairly regular turnover. They serve 3 years, is that right, Chief?
With a couple of extensions, but I think what we're, to assure you this, we have a systematic way of strategically talking about things, whether it's GED school, P3 school, FTO school. Those are ongoing schools in addition to the PSL 1, 2, and 3. Concurrent with that is in the last 4 years, the organization has put on one-day trainings or week-long trainings, whether it be MHIT for mental health, or it be de-escalation, command and control, use of force, review 1, 2, and 3. These are all schools that procedural justice, implicit bias has been integrated into. An aspect of, as we talk about an officer's engagement, the mission, the point of the training is infusion along each of those episodes. 5 years ago, this organization was not nearly as invested in those day-long and week-long training sessions, pulling people out of the field and dedicating them to this refresher. These are perishable skills, as was mentioned in passing. Interestingly, the police officer standards of training in the state doesn't require law as a perishable skill, yet that's what an officer's, as he or she acts, that's the things that that's the very tool they're relying upon. And so it's the persistence. I would look and reference back is we look at the 2016-17, and you'll see the 2018 use of force review, that we've talked about our training calendar and all the various means of which we've tried to stress the evolution of policing in the last 4 years here in Los Angeles and really across the country. And I'm proud of it's a multi-factors that they're addressing with many times existing staff, but also utilizing staff at the local level to hit these subjects. An officer who says, well, I just don't understand what's going on with implicit bias, it hasn't been at work. And if they were to say, well, I'm an officer who would deny that they have bias, or say, not me, they somehow they're immune to that. That was a conversation we'd have 5 years ago. I'm proud of Dr. Marks' his continued engagement. We're not just doing this internally. We're looking out to the outside experts and bringing them in and infusing their perspective as we go along, and it's multiple touch points.
Okay, so just so I'm clear, with respect to GED, it's not just this one-time training and giving it to supervisors, because as you said, there's the turnover, but also they're the unit that has to exercise a lot of discretion in the field, that you've institutionalized this training within the programs?
And roll call training. There's supervisory updates that are occurring on a quarterly basis. The roll call training is occurring daily in the sense of, and this unit in Metro is actually one of the few units that now enjoys some roll call time. Most of our rank and file in the geographic areas, it's get your radio and get out in the car. And so that's one of the areas that we're also looking to change in the coming months. But this is an area that these units are afforded substantial amount of discretion to involve in training. Proud of what Metropolitan does. The Metropolitan Division constantly has scheduled training days each deployment period, both in tactics as well as in the tradecraft of policing. And that is meant to reinforce and keep them primed at a level that we don't see shortfalls.
And my last question has to do with procedural justice, and I'll say I'm very heartened by the fact that talking to command staff, I hear them using the term and understanding the term quite often. The concern, of course, is being sure that, again, it reaches the rank and file and it's part of the organization's mantra. I think Dr. Purnell and you too, Chief, have talked about it, again, being infused in all of the trainings. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little more on that so I have a better understanding of what you mean by that.
Sure. And I think the other piece, just to emphasize and clear up the training for the GED officers, excuse me, as well, is GED officers don't only go to GED training. They go to multiple other department trainings as well. And so, for example, in our last training on integrating communication, de-escalation, and crowd control, every officer went through that, and that had elements of de-escalation, talking about active listening and different kinds of responses, and incorporating the discussion of procedural justice, even at a small level. We just want to make sure that they're continually hearing it. Probably some of the next ones, we're going to have that in a larger level. And as we're right now in the middle of redesigning supervisor school, pretty much all of our schools come up for modification every couple of years or so. And so we want to make sure that the schools, especially the ones where people are promoting, have that not just infused as a slight topic, but that they are challenged to think about that topic in the scope of their new position. So I guess the part of procedural justice, we need to make some more definition around that. And I was just actually talking with the chiefs about helping supervisors with some kind of cheat sheet as they're looking at a body camera. What is it exactly that they're looking for? And so that we give them some maybe that's
guidance.
Not the right term, but a handout or some kind of structure to help them look more clearly and know that they've identified the key issues and that those are more concrete for them. The next leadership brief that will be coming out on a quarterly basis, the next one is going to be on procedural justice. So we'll do another heavy push and then continue to infuse it throughout and look at other places in the department where we can see it surface.
Very good. And to the IG, my recollection is that there's an update on the 21st Century Policing Report coming out this year. Is that accurate? Or
There's not currently a set date for that. It's one of the projects that we have on our list, in addition to a report coming out on the Metro later this year, a report coming out on data-driven policing coming out next month. One of the things on our list to schedule in there. So we don't have a date on it set yet, but we can move forward towards setting one.
okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to public comment on 2B, then we have the chief's report, and then we have our public comment period. Do we have any public comments on 2B?
Yes, sir. We have 10 public comment cards.
Okay.
We start with Michael Novick, Hamed Khan, and Bruce Patton.
Michael Novick?
Yeah, you're trying to solve a problem with the wrong tools. Excuse me, the report identified almost equal numbers of stops of black, Latino, and white people, and of course that's not reflective of the number of stops. So right there you have a problem. Why didn't you take a study proportionate to the number of stops that are made for the study? Which would have shown that black people are disproportionately stopped. If black people in Los Angeles are disproportionately homeless and homeless people in Los Angeles are disproportionately black, if black girls are disproportionately punished and expelled from LA Unified, if black people are disproportionately stopped by the police, then you're looking at a systemic problem of racism. And just call it that, admit that, and deal with that. you're dealing with a society that's racist to its roots. You talk about reduction of crime in Los Angeles, but the FBI is investigating city council members and deputy mayors. So crime is not being reduced in Los Angeles. Crime in Los Angeles is a huge problem. You had a LAUSD board member who was forced to cop a plea and resigned from office because of his crimes. But you perceive crime as something that's racially skewed, and you deal with it that way, and that's a problem that you're not facing and not dealing with. It's not a problem of training individual officers. It's a problem of the fact that the law is racist. The Constitution is racist. And this body is racist. So you can drone on and then restrict the public comment to 2 minutes, but that's preposterous. You're not looking at the problem in its face, and you're not dealing with it. You're not going to solve it with the solutions you're coming up with.
Hamid Khan.
So we heard about an hour and 45 minutes of a whole lot of spin, and I was just thinking about going back to about 50 years ago, the Kerner Commission, the McCone Commission, the Christopher Commission, the consent decree, and on and on and on. And the same revolving conversation around research, around data, around training, give us more resources, give us more money, the same old bullshit, the spin that keeps on coming across. But what's interesting is that Dale Bonner and Shane Goldsmith, that neither one of you even asked that why didn't the audit went into details that they talk about proactive policing, that it's not calls for service, that it's initiated, but what are the programs that make up proactive policing? How are they being deployed? Why are they ending up in these places in the first place? What is happening in these cities? What happened to data-driven policing? That is your mandate. How come issues like laser, where you are targeted, you are harassed, you are stalked, you leave, you deploy, you are instructed by CSOCs, you're instructed as GED detail, you're instructed as Metro Policing to go looking for people, to go and make contact and go and harass people so they can be banished from the community. So I think the bigger question over here is that the audit clearly fails in that regard. The audit completely fails. It doesn't go into the details because we can talk about surface, we can talk about a Band-Aid, but we are not looking at the disease. We're looking at the symptoms of these issues. And the disease runs much deeper. The crash unit, which is now GED, was exactly what it did. This is what was going on. So I think there's a complete failure for you to be looking at this audit and not even asking those questions that what about a laser program? What about PredPol? How are these that is proactive policing. How do they result in creating conditions on the ground that it's going to result in this kind of contact, and it's going to result in unconstitutional searches and things like that because people are demanded and instructed to do that. And the red flags that were shown, none of them.
You want to call the next speaker, please?
The next speaker, Bruce Patton.
Bruce.
Followed by Jamie Garcia.
Come back during public comment. Please, come back during public comment. Please, your time's over. I've asked you, please. Okay, so will you stop disrupting the meeting, please?
Bruce Patton.
Next.
Followed by Jamie Garcia.
Bruce?
No, Bruce.
Not
Jamie
here.
Garcia. And Melanie Ochoa.
So as we continue to talk about data, I just want to remind folks that 85% is not enough. 15% of people's lives are being disrupted. They're being set up to be harassed, to be murdered. So 85%, we should not be giving them any kind of kudos for that. And, you know, I kind of want to talk about the, you know, and just uplifting what my colleague Hamid Khan was saying, is that this is not a moment in time, but it's how things operate. No matter what kind of reforms we've gone through, we're still back to the same problem of racism. And what's interesting is that we're down to the problem of racism, but now we have academics saying, well, we can't even prove racism. And then we have audits that are being done that don't even sufficiently give us information to let us know if racial bias is happening. So what's the point? What was the point of paying him to do anything if what he gave us, we can't even find out if you're being racist, which we all know, because the data doesn't matter. And I agree with you, Bonner. I agree that the data doesn't matter, it's people's stories. And even as you lifted, Shane Goldsmith, that people in the community, maybe they think that all they have is policing to deal with the problems and the issues in the community because they don't have an imagination to move beyond that, because there is this intense dependency. But stories matter. These are lives. Those stories matter. Just like when I uplifted Jesse Romero, that story matters. All those different stories are what is happening when law enforcement engages with our communities. So let's talk about structurally and institutionally what is going on. Why aren't we talking about Laser? Laser creates chronic offender bulletins that are based on a racist risk assessment that uses gang affiliation as a component of figuring out who they're going to track and trace. And then we don't even have to go into gang databases and gang injunctions and talk about how flawed that is. And so the narrative keeps getting pushed that gangs are what we're looking for. Gangs, gangs, gangs.
You want to call the next speaker, please?
The next speaker is Melanie Ochoa,
Thank you.
followed by Gina DiPietro.
Okay, next speaker, please. Next speaker, please. Morning, Melanie.
Melanie Ochoa with the ACLU. I appreciate the OIG's efforts in collecting this data because I know that without it, the department would continue to ignore these troubling practices that members of the public have been complaining about for years, if not decades. There are a number of unacceptable findings in this data, including the overall rate at which officers break the law when they stop or search members of the public. But I want to focus on the clear racial disparities in the way Black and Latino residents versus white residents are treated by the LAPD. The OIG observed no issues in 83% of stops of whites, but that was only true for about 48% of stops of Latinos and 52% of stops of Blacks. In other words, around half of the stops of Blacks or Latinos failed to have sufficient legal basis for a stop or a search or violated principles of procedural justice. Yet officers managed not to make these mistakes when stopping whites. The department has already responded with additional training, but what it needs to respond with is discipline. Unless officers in Topanga receive different training than officers in Newton and Southeast, then it doesn't seem like training is the problem. The problem is a willingness to violate this training when the target is Black or Latino, and a lack of accountability when they violate these policies and the law. I want to echo the calls by Commissioner Bonner for actual accountability. This is what allows this to continue to happen for decades and under every administration. Particularly if officers lied on police reports or in other official documents claiming consent or a basis to search where there is none, then they should have complaints filed against them and be disciplined, if not prosecuted, for these false statements. And this should be a part of the OIG's responsibility, to not just report the number of times officers violated law or policy, but to initiate corrective action against those individuals in addition to proposing system-wide solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker, Gina DiPietro, followed by General Dogan and Akili.
Good morning, LAPD Commission. I'd like to speak to the creative writing aspect of the automated field data reports. It frustrates me that the number of data points that we collect on people has gone up from 11 to maybe 43. That is making our police officers make assessments which they're truly incapable of, language fluidity, sexual orientation. I can't make those judgment calls. I can't make racial and ethnic calls. There needs to be a box that says undecided, undetermined, this is impossible based on my encounter with this person. Otherwise, we are in fact adding unbelievable amount of time to the reports that police officers have to make on a daily basis. They've gone up from having to make 11 data point entries to 43. So their paperwork time, which takes them out of the field, has gone up significantly. And we haven't matched that time that we're taking officers off the field by hiring more police officers. If you're going to take an officer off of the field for 45 minutes to an hour to complete creative writing data, you need to replace that officer's field time with more police officers. Otherwise, we are doing a disservice and we are creating mistrust with the community by not being available to the community when we are called upon by the community to respond. If you can't respond to a violent action, a cause for concern because they're prioritizing calls and it takes half an hour to get to somebody's house, there's no trust there. And we need to work on this as a bigger picture issue. Thank you so much.
The next speaker, General Dogan, followed by Keeley, followed by Adam Smith, and Gina Viola.
Good morning. The only worthwhile thing that came out of this presentation for me was watching you, Steve, get uncomfortable having to acknowledge the racism of this police department. There was a lot of talk in this presentation about how in a large number of stops the digital in-car video or the body cams couldn't hear the officers saying the reason for a stop for a search. But what does that really matter? By stating this as the baseline, we're supposed to take the word of an officer who gives a reason why they pulled someone over. It seems one of the goals of the audit is to make sure that police officers state a reason why a stop occurred. Not the reason, but a reason. So who cares? Who cares what the reason a police officer says for pulling someone over? Cop can, will, and does say anything to justify their actions. Feared for my life tells us that. You can talk all you want about the Fourth Amendment and procedural justice and transparency, but the truth is, it's not the reason for these stops that are problematic. It's the stops themselves. Yearly LAPD use of force reports show that at least 1/3 of the killings by the LAPD stem from these stops. We don't want officers to have a good reason to make these stops. We want the stops to stop. We want you to stop killing people. And I think it's important to note, as Hamid and Jamie brought up, talking about the continuation of history, of this cyclical idea of reform and doing better. The president of this commission in 2001 publicly opposed the federal consent decree, and this is the guy that's in charge of this so-called oversight commission. So the audit's bullshit. You all are bullshit.
Not to belabor the fact, but I wanted to talk about math, and I want to talk about 91 stops that you chose, you cherry-picked, and the racial makeup of that. When you had more than 8,200 stops, 96% of which were people of color, yet you chose 91 stops where 1/3 of those people were white. This report means absolutely nothing. I mean, has anybody taken a statistics class? I mean, how does this apply? How is this applicable? How are we to... of 7% of those are of concern. 7% of 91 stops. 91 stops where, 7% of 8,200 stops is 577 stops that are of concern. And we do know that a lot of these stops result in officer-involved shootings. So I think we've heard what we needed. In the OIG sample, GED officers were less likely to find a reason to arrest, cite, or warn black or Hispanic males whom they stopped as compared to white males. Yet, black and Hispanic males continue to be stopped more frequently. I don't know how many different ways we have to say it, how many different times we have to point this out to you. At the root of this, it is a racist system. At the root of it. Your own reports substantiate that. Your own reports that you cherry pick to make it anything other but. Approximately 1/3 of officer-involved killings stem from police stops. They stem from this. Thank you.
We have no other comment cards on this item.
Report of the chief. Chief, good morning, sir.
Mr. President, you have some final action on this
okay,
item, I'm
sorry.
sure.
We have a motion on the Inspector General's report.
I'd like to move the report and also ask for, and I've coordinated both with the department and the Inspector General on this request and believe it reflects their input to have the department report back in 45 days on the plan to implement the recommendations and progress toward that. And then secondly, to have the Inspector General report back in the context of the Metro report, which is forthcoming in the second half of the year, to fold into that report progress on the impact of the implementation of recommendations on behavior.
Okay, we have a second. All in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, 45 days.
Mr. President, may
Yes,
I
sir.
bring to your attention that we have family here on item 5A, 1 and 2, and if you could advance that so they could have their opportunity to speak to the commission,
Let's let
that
them,
would be appreciated.
Yeah, let's let them go ahead now.
So that would be 5A, 1 and 2 to call for
Okay.
speaker cards.
We
5A.
have Andre Nazarians for 5A1.
Apparently he changed his mind. He does not want to speak. Are there any other speaker cards?
For 5A1, sir, yes, we have Michael Novick and Adam Smith.
Well, can we hold that till we get back to?
It's up to you, sir.
Okay.
You're the chair.
Is there family on 5A2? No?
I do not believe there are, sir.
Okay, good. So let's go back to the report of the chief. Chief?
Commissioners, good morning. Relative to significant events this last week, I want to point out that we ended the month of January with no officer-involved shootings. This last week, we had no categorical uses of force. As far as outreach and engagement, had a number of different activities. Last week, I met with heads of each of the major employee organizations throughout the department. We had a good discussion relative to emerging issues, their state of the operation, if we will, morale within the organizations. We talked about some of the coming changes with the innovation group recommendations, and it was a worthwhile meeting on my part just to see their engagement, their willingness to partner with us on a number of issues, to include their willingness to have a conversation on a video with employees across the organization to talk about the zero tolerance for issues of sexual harassment, for discrimination, as well as to talk briefly about this recognizing the last 6 months or so we've had a couple different reports, very disturbing ones, about employees using videos of that or photographs of one another or purported to be one another and spreading them or sending them to others in the organization. I was encouraged by the leadership within that group, and I look forward to this week formalizing a message for all of our rank and file and all members of the organization relative to the standard of this organization, the value of this organization in regards to our intolerance of any type of discrimination regardless of its source, as well as the consequences that should someone believe that distributing disturbing and pornographic and improper imaging, there'll be a swift and certain consequence for that should we find an employee engaged in that. But I think what most important of that was, again, this organization speaks well when it's not just the chief speaking. And again, I'm happy that that the employee groups have decided to take this step into this issue. Last week on Thursday, I mentioned earlier, we had our industry and academia, as well as leaders from throughout policing across the country, attend the Police Executive Research Forum, LAPD Less Lethal Symposium. It was a day-long opportunity for us to challenge ourselves as an industry, as a profession, to also challenge the manufacturers and those who produce various tactics and tools for policing of how do we go about lowering and eliminating the use of deadly force while protecting the lives of our community as well as our officers. There was no easy answers, but I think that it framed up the challenges before us, and I look forward to seeing what in this country of innovation we can develop as the next generation of policing moves into this next decade. This is American Black History Month.
and I'm proud of the contributions of the African American men and women within the organization, both sworn and civilian. And on Saturday, I was happy to attend a Able Black History celebration, along with Mr. Tiefenk was there for the luncheon, and we recognized the legacy of LAPD and the many leaders of our past. So I was happy to see people such as Assistant Chief Banks, Assistant Chief J.I. Davis, others that have make up our history and have helped us reform the way we police the city, and also remind us of our history of segregation and some of the darker moments in our history relative to black history. Lastly, yesterday I was at the Watts Gang Task Force. I was joined there by Commissioner Decker and Cole Smith. Thank you for your attendance. And I discussed briefly there the GED inspection that was completed by the Office of Inspector General. Talked briefly about some of the results and our actions forward, and took questions from the group. And it was a good exchange and dialogue, and one that I will continue to do periodically. And I was also encouraged by the reinforcing nature of the community that was thankful for the work that we're doing, but also mindful that we don't always get it right, and challenging us to continue to hold officers when we fall short accountable, and also acknowledging that they see that accountability and that they have seen it where and when it has happened, and they're grateful for that. So I think it was a good discussion, and one that weekly meeting continues to, in my view, produce the results that we're seeing, which is lessening gang violence and its hold on a community in some very violent impacted portions of our city. In transitioning over to crime, we have started this year with we now have a month with crime stats ending February 2nd of reductions in all categories. And while the percentages are significant because of small numbers, they are trending all in a very productive and positive manner. What I mean by that is 17 homicides year to date versus 26 last year. Shooting violence with 14% fewer shots fired or victims that have been shot, and reductions also in our property crime arena. And looking at our gang-related crime, that is the area that we've seen the greatest reduction in our homicides. Again, more than 50% fewer gang-related homicides year to date in this first month. So these are good trends. We're starting out the year. I'm encouraged by that, and look forward to our continued work and working with our communities to ensure that this has legs throughout 2019. As I said earlier, we closed the month of January with 0 officer-involved shootings for the year. As a point of reference, last year at this time, by February 2nd, we had 4 officer-involved shootings with hits, 2 officer-involved shootings with no hits, for a total of 6. 2 of those were fatal. Moving beyond our officer-involved shootings, talk about our public contacts. That information on gun recoveries are both to be updated here at the end of February. Relative to traffic safety, we have seen a reduction in our total number of serious and fatal collisions, with 82 year-to-date versus 102 last year. Our hit and runs, again, similarly a drop with serious injuries or death-related hit and runs, 16 year-to-date versus 24 last year. Motor vehicles versus PED, similarly 33 this year versus 49 last year. And bicycle-involved collisions, we have had 5 involving serious injuries or deaths versus 8 the year before. Some of this may be weather influenced. Pedestrians and cyclists are somewhat impacted by rainy weather, but again, I'm thankful for the numbers that we have and have the ability to report. Regarding sworn personnel and civilian personnel on payroll, as of January 19th, we're at 10,072 sworn personnel on payroll, 3,020 civilians, and 386 reserve officers, and 1,428 cadets. And that concludes my remarks, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions of the chief? Public comments?
We have 3 public comments. We have Michael Novick, Paula Miner, and Adam Smith.
Yeah, I'm wondering if Chief Moore, if you're familiar with the book Chokehold, Policing Black Men.
Yes.
I want to read a few things from here. It says, racist cops not the main problem. Most police officers are decent men and women with no more racial hang-ups than teachers, doctors, or anyone else. As we will see, the crisis in law and order in the United States stems from police work itself rather than from individual cops. The problem is the criminal process itself. Cops routinely hurt and humiliate black people because that is what they are paid to do. Talking specifically about the question of stops, which you were looking at, he talks about the Terry decision, which legalizes stop and frisk under the requirement of reasonableness. And he says 40 years later, we see that crime detection is not well served by stop and frisk. Terry's likely remain good constitutional law for a long time. This truth helps us understand that the Constitution may be an insufficient instrument for regulating the police. Just because the police can legally maintain a practice does not mean that they should. And he documents the drop in stop and frisk in New York over 5 years from 685,000 people being stopped and frisked by the LAPD to by the NYPD to 22,000 in 2015. And in that period of time, the murder rate dropped by 32%, and all major crimes in New York, including homicide, reached record lows. So I think that you need to take these things into account. You should be talking about how to stop stops. What people said earlier is absolutely the case. The disproportionate police killings and shootings of black people and brown people are the tip of the iceberg of disproportionate stops, disproportionate frisks, disproportionate escalation. In all the studies that were not mentioned, they found that the contraband found among white people stopped was in far greater excess than any found in black and brown people stopped. So that's an evidence that your policing is based on.
We have no other cards on item number 3. We're now on item number 4, public comment. We have 8 comment cards. Begin with Michael Novick, Jamie Garcia, and Zach Sherwin.
Yeah, my comment to the police commission again is that you need to move these meetings out of the LAPD headquarters, the police administration building, into the community in the evenings. I want to point out that the LA Police Commission, the LA City Council, the Sheriff's Oversight Commission, the Board of Supervisors now all meet at the same time. I think that it's imperative that you change your meeting to the evenings when people can come and talk about what's going on. And then you'll get more accurate and more complete responses from the community. And the community will hear some of what you're doing behind essentially closed doors, behind a wall of police. So I think that needs to be said again. Akili is back, and he had to leave. You drone on for so long, and then you restrict public comment to 2 minutes. Very few people, bother doing what I do, which is filing a card on almost everything of substance that you deal with. So I think that I don't know, I missed a week because I had to go on some family business. But has the report on how much money was donated during the course of the last year and what it was spent on come out yet? No. So when does that due?
It should be next week, sir.
All right. I look forward to seeing it, and I look forward to you changing your policies and rejecting all of those sums of money and telling the providers to donate it to better purposes such as housing, health care, education, job training. I just want to say one last thing, that when 3 young black men or 3 young Latino men are perceived as a gang in a car on a street corner, and 3 young white men are perceived as a fraternity or a band, that's the fundamental basis of the kind of policing you're talking about. These discretionary police forces are an example of the police operating as a internal border guard in communities of
Jamie Garcia, Zach Sherwin, Paula Miner, Adam Smith.
Yeah, I guess first thing, I'm going to speak about some procedural stuff today. The metal detector outside has been inoperative for months, and people who are waiting to come into this meeting are standing out there for like 15, 20 minutes to undergo this laborious slow process. So please get that machine fixed so that the searches don't have to happen by hand. It literally has been months. Or better yet, have the meetings not here so that people don't have to go through a metal detector, as all these activists have been beseeching you for months. Okay, so much has been raised of substance that I'm almost loath to just bring up what happens here in the room, but I do need to call stuff out when I see it. You know, Commissioner Soboroff has been on pretty good behavior this week. Commissioner Bonner, Commissioner Figueroa Villa, you weren't here last week, but the kind of behavior that we saw last week in terms of barking at activists, people who were speaking up here, issuing warnings, screamed out at people on an arbitrary basis, it's absolutely out of control. And I just want to ask you, you know, there's a family here today of someone who has been killed by police. They've left. It's their first time coming here. And to have them, you know, hear that the other family wasn't here to speak and Commissioner Soboroff to say, okay, good, that there wasn't a family here to talk. I mean, what is it like for you to be commissioners on this board, to be the chief of this police department and know that that's who's the president at the head of this commission? I mean, I cannot imagine what it's like to go out of here when all of us aren't looking at you and you have to maintain this face of unity and solidarity to just have one-on-one interactions with someone who's at the head of your board and behaves themselves that way. I also just want to point out, I'm glad nothing happened, but there was someone here last week who, a white man who Commissioner Soboroff told to be escorted out of the room by officers. It never happened. That does happen all the time to black activists. Their protest is criminalized in here, and it's a double standard.
Gina Viola, John Avalos, and Eugene.
I too want to talk about the criminalization of black protest in this room. It is imperative that you have the charges dropped against Dr. Abdullah. It is so indicative of the organization as a whole that you are going to continue to criminalize her for something. One of the charges, which was on a day, May 8th, and it was me who was forcing my way out of the room. Dr. Abdullah never touched the officer. And I think that's the most serious charge that she faces for something that I was doing. So it is imperative that you drop those charges. You talked to the city attorney about that. We delivered 10,000 signatures to him this morning for that. So the city is on our side on that as well. Shane Goldsmith, I'm so troubled that you were the victim of gang violence and that you sit on this board. I think it would excuse you from many juries, and I wonder how it makes you able to be objective here as a member of this commission. So I find that very troubling. I mean, I'm horribly sad for you that you had that, but I don't understand how you can sit up here and be objective overseeing the police with that. I want to echo again, please move these meetings. And for reasons that Mr. Novick just pointed out, I would like to go to City Hall occasionally. I would like to go to Board of Supervisors occasionally. We cannot be in 3 places at the same time. I don't know why the city structured it this way, but you should move these meetings. This isn't where these meetings should be. More community members should be participating in this regularly. Have these meetings in the evening out in the community. Thank you.
John Avalos.
Yes, beseeching, we've been beseeching your word that you used for these evening meetings or having the meetings at another time. Yeah, I want to go to the commission with the sheriffs and city council. Now, here we are talking now, and everybody's gone. Are the cameras still on while I'm talking? I know she's still doing her stenographing, but is the video on while I'm talking? Oh, good. I'm glad. Oh, my God. Dr. Abdullah, I was here the day Dr. Abdullah never made it into the space. She was arrested on her way over here, out there somewhere. And I was here that day also. I can't believe what you're doing to her. Oh, my God. I think she might go to jail for a year because an officer says she grabbed his arm. People, what are you doing? Senora, what are your colleagues doing to Professor Abdullah? Oh, it's horrible. And I remember that elderly man, Tud Hayes. What did you all do to him? I was here. I've been here 3 years. You weren't here yet, Mr. Moore. What you all did to Tud Hayes, and he showed up when you had your meeting at the Uberoth area, the Uberoth field. He showed up there in his wheelchair. He's still trying to tell his story of what you all did to him. You used the gang concept about 1,000 times today in your defense to the report of your biased policing. Gangs. That's terrible. And Jesse Romero, I have 3 seconds. I was at his trial, and his officer, the officer that killed Jesse, covered the camera.
Next speaker.
Eugene.
Eugene.
Okay, Eugene's not here. Okay, we're now on item number 5, and I do have 2 comment cards for each item. I have Michael Novick for 5A1 and Adam Smith for 5A1. Mr. Novick for 5A2 and Mr. Novick for 5B.
So why don't you just do all your 6 minutes and go all the way through?
Okay. So you have, again, 6 more officers here involved in an officer-involved shooting last February. The victim was a man named Nazarians. I assume that's an Armenian name. And I think that's further evidence of the kind of biased policing, if you want to call it that takes place, very few white people are shot and killed by the LAPD, and when they are, it's might typically be someone who's also ethnically identified as an oppressed person. So I think, again, that you have the responsibility to look at this systemically. If you have 6 officers in this case, you have a sergeant and 2 more officers in the next one with a law enforcement-related injury.
Commissioner, could you hold his time for just a moment for a point of clarification?
Sure.
Mr. Novak, the listing of those officers by rank and pay grade does not indicate that does not mean that each of them were involved in the actual shooting or use of deadly force.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Okay, just want to be clear.
Yeah.
Okay, for the audience and others to know that there were not 6 officers involved. The report will come out and demonstrate and report the number, which officer was involved in the actual use of deadly force.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, the 20-some-odd officers who were at the scene when Rodney King was beaten were not all involved in the beating, but they all let the beating proceed. They were not all LAPD. They were LA school police department officers there on the scene. The police have that pack mentality. And so I'm not saying every single one of these officers shot and killed a man. Obviously not. One of them probably did, maybe 2. But I'm saying that it's a systemic problem. You need to look at it in terms of patterns and practices and the system, not to evaluate the individual culpability of which one of these particular officers was involved or who could have stopped it from happening or who escalated it so that the firing happened. But you need to look at it in terms of the fact that over the course of a year, you have 9, 10, 15 officers a week that you're looking at. And over the course of a year, that's 500 officers, and that's a significant portion of the department year after year that you're looking at. In this way, you need to look at it systemically. That's what I'm saying. I don't know what the injury was that the man, Mr. Chavez, suffered, but by his name, I assume that he's Latino. And again, I think this reflects, what we've talked about here over and over again, who gets victimized by the LAPD. So I think that you need to face that reality and deal with it systemically and look at it not as a problem just of policing, but as a problem of the law that the law is enforcing, and make some recommendations to change some of the laws, as well as changing the nature of policing. Last item I'll comment on is 5B1, which is an evaluation of the chief of police. It's a board action on annual evaluation, and I think that the comments that the chief made to the press a week or so ago in relation to the disclosures of the level of discriminatory stops by the Metropolitan Division should be taken into account. I think also the fact that the chief is one of the beneficiaries of the outrageous drop program should be taken into account, and I think that if you're step up to your duties as the police commission, as opposed to being derelict as you usually are, you would have a negative evaluation of the chief.
And we did have one card for 5B for Akili, who's not present. The Board of Police Commissioners will now recess into closed session to discuss item numbers 5A and 5B in accordance with Government Code 54957. The Board of Police Commissioners has concluded its work in closed session. We are back in open session. In closed session, item number 5A1 was discussed and the chief's recommendations were unanimous. Oh, I'm sorry. Correction. In closed session, item number 5H1 was discussed and the chief's recommendations were approved as amended by a vote of 3-2. And in closed session, item number 5A2 was discussed, and the chief's recommendations were unanimously adopted. In closed session, item 5B was discussed.
Very good. Is there a motion to adjourn? All in favor? We stand adjourned then. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Cindy, and I'm in Little Tokyo, and you're watching Channel 35, Your City, Your Channel.
The more we get together to